February 14th, 1943, mid-afternoon. The outskirts of Sidi Bouzid, Tunisia. The sun is a white disk hammered flat against a bleached sky, and the heat rising off the cracked earth bends the horizon into something liquid, something alive. Feldwebel Karl Brandt, 20, 1st Panzer Division, 3rd Company, is crouched behind a low wall of stacked sandbags, his MG-40, cooling beside him. Its barrel still ticking from a burst he had fired 3 minutes ago at a column of American half-tracks, retreating across the basin below. He is 26 years old. He has fought in Poland. He has fought in France. He has fought across the sands of Libya under Rommel himself. He knows the mathematics of war. Range, cover, suppression, withdrawal. He knows what kills and what protects. And until this moment, he has believed that a well-built position, fortified with sandbags and flanked by stone, is enough. He is about to learn otherwise. It starts as a sound, not the ripping canvas shriek of his own MG-42, not the sharp, familiar crack of a Car 98, or the staccato pop of American Garands echoing off the ridgeline. This is something lower, something slower, a deep, percussive hammering. Thum, 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 thum. Each report separated by just enough silence for the brain to register it, to anticipate the next one, to understand that each beat is a half-inch diameter slug of hardened steel crossing the distance between life and death at nearly 3,000 feet per second. Brandt doesn't see the weapon at first. The sound seems to come from everywhere, from the sky, from the desert floor, from inside his own chest. Then the sandbags in front of him explode. Not scatter, not shift, explode. The first round punches clean through 2 layers of packed burlap and sand, a barrier that would stop any rifle bullet on earth, and exits the backside trailing a fist-sized cone of debris. The second round hits the stone wall behind the sandbags and sends a shower of rock fragments, slicing through the air like shrapnel. The third round finds the MG-42's ammunition box and detonates the belt inside with a sharp, sympathetic crack that drops every man in the position flat to the ground. Brandt presses himself into the dirt. His ears are ringing. His hands are shaking. Dust and sand fill his mouth, coat his eyes. He has survived artillery barrages at Tobruk. He has weathered RAF-strafing runs in the open desert. But this is different. This is not an area weapon. This is not suppression. Each round feels aimed. Each impact feels personal. And the position he has spent 40 minutes building, the position his training told him would hold, has been dismantled in less than 10 seconds. 300 meters away, mounted on the turret ring of an American M3 half-track, an M2 Browning heavy machine gun is doing exactly what John Moses Browning designed it to do nearly 25 years earlier. The gunner, Private First Class Raymond Coletti, from Bridgeport, Connecticut, 20 years old, a factory worker's son who 9 months ago had never fired anything larger than a .22 rifle at tin cans behind his uncle's barn, is pressing his thumbs into the butterfly trigger and walking the weapon across the German line with a calm, mechanical rhythm that betrays how little he understands about what he is accomplishing. He doesn't know that the rounds leaving his barrel are carrying 12,000 foot-pounds of energy. He doesn't know that each bullet can penetrate nearly an inch of rolled homogeneous steel armor at this range. He doesn't know the physics, the engineering, the decades of refinement that went into the weapon vibrating between his hands. He only knows that when he presses the trigger, things in front of him come apart. And that is the terrifying simplicity of the M250 caliber machine gun. It does not require understanding. It does not demand expertise. It requires only ammunition and someone willing to hold the trigger. And the American war machine, by 1943, is producing both in quantities the Wehrmacht cannot fathom. But to understand why German soldiers came to fear the M2 more than almost any other weapon in the Allied arsenal, more than the Sherman tank, more than the P-47 Thunderbolt, more than the naval guns that would later pound their positions along the Atlantic Wall, you have to understand what it took from them. Not just lives, not just vehicles. It took the one thing that every soldier, on every side, clings to in order to keep functioning under fire. It took the belief that cover could save you. The story of the M2 Browning does not begin in the deserts of North Africa, of course. It begins in the mind of a man who had been dead for nearly 17 years before the first shots of the Second World War were fired. John Moses Browning, born in Ogden, Utah in 1855, the son of a gunsmith, a man who by the age of 13 had built his first functioning firearm from scrap metal in his father's workshop, was, by any objective measure, the most prolific firearms designer in human history. By the time of his death in 1926, he had been granted 128 patents. He had designed pistols, shotguns, rifles, and machine guns that would arm half the nations on Earth: the 1911 pistol, the BAR, the M1919 medium machine gun, each one a masterwork of mechanical engineering, each one still in service decades after his passing. But the M2 was different. The M2 was his answer to a question the First World War had barely begun to ask. What happens when the targets get harder, when aircraft climb higher, when vehicles grow thicker, when the battlefield stretches beyond the range of rifle caliber weapons? What do you reach for? Browning's answer was a scaled-up version of his M1917 water-cooled machine gun, redesigned around a cartridge that was itself a feat of engineering, the 50 BMG, or Browning machine gun cartridge, a round originally developed from a scaled-up 30-06 Springfield case necked up to accept a bullet that weighed more than 700 grains and measured half an inch across its base. The weapon that emerged, first as the M1921, then refined through a series of iterations into the M2HB, the heavy barrel variant that would become standard, was not elegant. It was not light. At 84 pounds for the receiver alone, plus another 44 pounds for the tripod, it was a crew-served beast that required at minimum 2 men to carry and operate. It fired at a rate of between 450 and 600 rounds per minute, slow by the standards of the era, almost leisurely compared to the MG-42's 1,200 rounds per minute. But rate of fire was never the point. The point was what happened at the other end. The point was what happened at the other end. And what happened at the other end was annihilation on a scale that no infantry class weapon had ever delivered. A standard 7.92 2x50 7mm Mauser round, the cartridge that fed every German K-90, 8K rifle and MG-40, 2 machine gun on the battlefield, left the barrel carrying roughly 500 joules of kinetic energy. It could kill a man at 1,000 meters. It could penetrate a steel helmet at 600. Against sandbags, against timber, against the packed earth of a well-dug foxhole, it was deadly, but it was stoppable. 2 layers of sandbags would absorb it. A brick wall would hold. A vehicle's engine block would catch it and keep it there. German defensive doctrine was built on this understanding that field fortifications, properly constructed, could neutralize direct fire from infantry weapons. Find cover, dig in, wait for the enemy to expose himself, and let the MG-42, the finest general-purpose machine gun in the world, do its work. It had worked in France. It had worked in Russia. It had worked in the desert, on the steppes, in the hedgerows and hilltops of a continent at war. And then the .50 caliber arrived, and the math changed overnight. A single round of 50 BMG, the M2 armor piercing variant that became standard issue by 1943, carried more than 17,000 joules of energy at the muzzle, nearly 5 times the energy of the German standard rifle round. But energy alone does not explain the terror. What explained the terror was what that energy did to the things soldiers hid behind. Sandbags, the universal currency of infantry protection, required a minimum of 4 layers to reliably stop a .50 caliber round. Most field positions used 2. Against the M2, 2 layers of sandbags were tissue paper. The round passed through them trailing a cone of sand and fabric and continued into whatever, or whoever, was behind them with enough residual energy to kill at distance. Brick walls, the kind that lined every village, every farmhouse, every church in France and Italy and Belgium, where German troops would make their desperate stands, crumbled. A sustained burst from an M2 didn't chip at masonry. It excavated it. Gunners learned to aim at the same spot, round after round, and within seconds a fist-sized hole would become an arm-sized hole, and then the wall would simply give way, collapsing inward and burying the men who had trusted it. Engine blocks, the last resort of a soldier caught in the open near a vehicle, the one piece of metal thick enough to stop nearly anything, failed against the armor, piercing 50 BMG. German troops who dove behind the engines of their Opel Blitz trucks, their Kia Bielwagens, their SDKFZ2 51 half-tracks, discovered that the rounds punched through cast iron and aluminum as if they weren't there. Trucks didn't just stop running when an M2 found them. They disintegrated, fuel lines severed, radiators burst, tires shredded, and the men crouching behind those vehicles learned, if they survived long enough to learn anything, that the M2 did not distinguish between soft targets and hard ones. Even light armor, the 14.5mm steel plate that protected the front of an SDKFZ2 50 1/2-track, the standard armored workhorse of the German Panzergrenadier divisions, could be penetrated at ranges under 500 meters by the M2's armor-piercing rounds. German half-track crews, men who had grown accustomed to the relative safety of their armored shells against rifle fire and shell fragments, found themselves suddenly vulnerable to a weapon that could be mounted on a jeep. And this is where the psychological dimension began to take hold. Oberleutnant Werner Pluskett, an artillery officer who would later become famous for his position overlooking Omaha Beach on D-Day, described in his post, war accounts the particular dread that accompanied the sound of the .50 caliber. It was not the fear of a single bullet, he explained. It was the fear of inadequacy, of realizing that everything you had been trained to do, dig in, take cover, return fire, was insufficient. The weapon invalidated the instincts that kept soldiers alive. Consider the experience of a German infantry squad in Normandy, July 1944. They are dug into a hedgerow position, the bocage, That ancient labyrinth of earth and root and tangled vegetation that the Allies would spend weeks and thousands of lives fighting through. They have an MG-40, two with interlocking fields of fire. They have riflemen in prepared positions. They have overhead cover against mortar fragments. By every measure of German defensive doctrine, they are in a strong position. Then an American armored column advances down the lane. Leading it is a jeep with a pedestal-mounted M2. Behind it, two Shermans with 50 caliber mounts on their turrets. Behind those, a half-track with another M2 on its ring mount. The MG-42 opens fire first. It always does. Its rate of fire is devastating. American infantry drops. The advance stalls for a moment, and then the 50 calibers answer. The hedgerow, that ancient wall of earth and root that has stopped musket balls and Mauser rounds for centuries, begins to come apart. The M2 rounds don't ricochet off the packed earth the way rifle bullets do. They bore through it. They shatter roots as thick as a man's wrist. They pass through the embankment and continue into the fighting positions behind it. The MG-40, two-gunner, tucked into what he believed was a fortress, hears the deep thud, thud, thud of rounds impacting the earth above him, beside him, through the earth in front of him, and he understands, in a moment of sickening clarity, that his position is not a position at all. It is a suggestion, a prayer, and the M2 does not answer prayers. Those who survived these encounters carried the memory like a scar. Post-war interviews with German veterans, collected by historians like Stephen Ambrose, Anthony Beaver, and the U.S. Army's own historical division, reveal a remarkably consistent theme. German soldiers did not speak of the 50 caliber the way they spoke of other weapons. They did not describe it with the grudging professional respect they afforded the Russian T-30, 4 or the British 20, 5-pounder. They described it with something closer to helplessness. You could not hide from it. One veteran of the 350 2nd Infantry Division recalled. You could only hope it was not pointed at you. And that hope, by the final year of the war, was growing thinner by the day, because the M2 was not a rare weapon. It was not a specialist tool deployed in limited numbers. By 1944, the United States had produced more than 2 million of them. They were mounted on tanks, half-tracks, jeeps, trucks, aircraft, patrol boats, and fixed anti-aircraft positions. They were carried forward by infantry units as heavy weapons. They were deployed at every level of the American military, from company to corps. A single American armored division might field hundreds of M2s across its vehicles alone. And unlike the complex, temperamental weapons that plagued every army, the early Sten guns that jammed at a whisper of dust, the German MG-42s whose rapid fire ate through barrels in minutes, the Soviet PPSH-40, ones that froze solid in winter, the M2 simply worked. Its recoil, operated action, a design essentially unchanged from Browning's original 1918 concept, was so mechanically robust that it functioned in desert heat, Arctic cold, tropical humidity, and the churned mud of a Norman battlefield without modification. Soldiers cleaned it, fed it, and it fired. That was the contract, and the M2 never broke it. By the time the war reached Germany itself, the final, grinding advance through the Siegfried Line, across the Rhine, into the shattered cities of the Ruhr, the M2 had become something more than a weapon. It had become a symbol. To the Americans who wielded it, it was the great equalizer, the gun that could answer any problem, silence any position, reach any target. To the Germans who faced it, it was the sound of a war they could no longer win. That slow, deliberate, unhurried hammering, thum, 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 echoing off the rubble of their own cities, punching through the walls of their own homes, finding them in places where no bullet had any right to reach. They did not hate the M2 because it was powerful. Every army had powerful weapons. They did not hate it because it was loud. The Eastern Front had taught them to endure sounds far worse. They hated it because it was honest. It told you exactly what it was going to do. Destroy everything between itself and you, and then it did exactly that. No negotiation, no cleverness, no escape. Just that sound, deep, mechanical, and final, and the silence that always came after. But here's what most people never think about. The M2 wasn't the only weapon that broke the rules of the battlefield. There were others. Weapons so devastating, so psychologically crushing, that entire units refused to advance the moment they heard them. Weapons that both sides tried to ban. Weapons that soldiers on the winning side felt guilty for using. And some of those stories have never been properly told. If this is the kind of history that pulls you in, the kind that puts you inside the moment and makes you feel what those men felt, then you're in the right place. This is WW2 Forgotten 45, and we don't just tell you what happened. We make you understand why it still matters. Subscribe now. Turn on notifications, because the next story we're telling, it's one that most history channels won't touch. And once you hear it, you'll understand why.